Kyle wanted to keep racing and stay active. That way he could race against Brexton. To have that moment of symbolization for Kyle and just see Brexton standing there, there's a moment of, wow, he's gone. And we're not going to get him back.
For more than 2 decades, the name Busch meant speed, controversy, championships, and an almost unbelievable level of competitiveness in NASCAR. Kurt Busch came first. Then came Kyle, 2 brothers from Las Vegas who grew up around racing and eventually became 2 of the most recognizable drivers of their generation. They weren't simply brothers who happened to race. They were competitors. They were rivals. They were teammates at different points in their lives. They were each other's measuring stick. And despite the arguments, the crashes, the disagreements, and the enormous pressure that came with carrying the Busch name, there was always something connecting them that the racing world could never fully understand. Family. Then, on May 21st, 2026, everything changed. Kyle Busch died at just 41 years old after severe bacterial pneumonia progressed into sepsis, causing rapid and overwhelming complications. His family later confirmed the cause of death, while his death certificate indicated that he had experienced pneumonia symptoms for days to weeks before the fatal complications developed. The news was almost impossible for NASCAR fans to comprehend. Kyle Busch had spent his entire life looking like someone who could survive anything. He had crashed race cars. He had competed through injuries. He had won championships. He had raced when other drivers would have stayed home. He had built a reputation around toughness and aggression. But the thing that finally took him away wasn't a racing accident. It wasn't a wreck. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was an illness. And for his older brother, Kate, the loss was not the loss of a NASCAR statistic. It was the loss of his little brother. That distinction matters, because when the public remembers Kyle Busch, it remembers a driver. Kurt remembers a kid. He remembers the younger brother who grew up watching him. He remembers the boy who eventually decided that being Kurt Busch's little brother wasn't enough. He wanted his own name, his own career, his own championships, and eventually he got all of them. Kyle became a 2-time NASCAR Cup Series champion and one of the most successful drivers in the history of the sport. Reuters reported in August 2026 that he finished his career with 234 victories across NASCAR's 3 national series, a total that placed him at the top of that category. But none of those numbers prepared Kurt for the phone call that changed his life. The Busch brothers' story began long before the trophies, long before the sponsorships, long before the television cameras. It began in Las Vegas, where racing was already part of the family culture. Their father, Tom Busch, helped nurture that passion. Kurt was the older brother, and when Kurt started making his way toward NASCAR, Kyle watched closely. For a younger brother, an older sibling can become almost impossible to separate from the idea of what is possible. Kurt showed Kyle that a kid from Las Vegas could make it, that racing didn't have to remain a hobby, that the family dream could become a career. But there was another side to that relationship. Kyle didn't want to spend his life being introduced as Kurt's younger brother. He wanted people to know Kyle Busch, and that ambition became one of the defining forces of his career. The younger Busch wasn't satisfied with being good. He wanted to win. He wanted to dominate. He wanted to prove that he belonged. And sometimes that meant proving it against the person closest to him, his brother. Their relationship was never simple. It wasn't the kind of Hollywood sibling story where 2 brothers hug before every race and tell each other how proud they are. Racing doesn't work that way, especially not at the highest level. Every driver wants the same thing: track position, victory, the championship. And sometimes a driver standing between you and that victory is your brother. That's what made the Busch story so fascinating. They could be fiercely competitive on Sunday and still be family on Monday. They could disagree without necessarily losing the bond underneath the disagreement. And through all of it, Kurt watched Kyle evolve. The kid became a professional driver. The professional became a star. The star became a champion. And eventually, Kyle became something even bigger. He became one of the defining figures of modern NASCAR. His personality helped create a massive fan following. His aggressive driving style created enemies. His victories created respect. And his willingness to say exactly what he thought made him one of the most polarizing drivers the sport had seen in years. Some fans loved him. Some couldn't stand him. But almost nobody ignored him. That was Kyle Busch. He had presence. And he had speed. Lots of it. His career was extraordinary. He won his first Cup championship in 2015. Then, after years of additional success and setbacks, he captured his second championship in 2019. He also became famous for his extraordinary consistency across NASCAR's National Series, Truck Series, Xfinity Series, Cup Series. Kyle raced everywhere, and he won everywhere. That appetite for competition became part of his identity. But behind the driver was another Kyle, the family man, the husband, the father, the mentor, the businessman, the owner who helped younger drivers, and the person who understood that racing wasn't only about himself. Kyle Busch Motorsports became an important part of that legacy. Through the organization, Kyle helped younger racers develop their careers and gain opportunities that might otherwise have been difficult to find. Some of those drivers would eventually reach NASCAR's highest levels. That meant Kyle's influence went beyond the races he personally won. He helped create opportunities for people who came after him. And that is something Kurt understood particularly well, because Kurt had been in Kyle's position before. He had been the young driver trying to make it. He had experienced the pressure. He knew what it meant to have every mistake analyzed. He knew what it meant to be judged not only as a driver but as a member of the Busch family. And he knew exactly how much pressure Kyle carried. That may be one reason the brothers' relationship was so complicated. Kurt was not simply Kyle's brother. He was also the person who understood the world Kyle had entered better than almost anyone. There were moments when that understanding created closeness, and there were moments when it created tension. Because two highly competitive people don't always need outsiders to create conflict. Sometimes a competition is enough. But when Kyle died, the old rivalry suddenly became meaningless. The arguments didn't matter. The championship battles didn't matter. The moments when one brother beat the other didn't matter. There was only one fact left. Kyle was gone, and the suddenness of his death made it even harder. Kyle had been dealing with illness before his death. According to the Associated Press, his death certificate later indicated that he had experienced bacterial pneumonia symptoms for days to weeks. He remained active during that period, however, and continued participating in racing-related activities. That detail changes how people look at the final weeks of his life. Because Kyle didn't look like someone preparing to disappear from the sport. He was still living, still racing, still working, still making plans, still being a father, still being Kyle Busch. Then everything changed with terrifying speed. On May 20th, Kyle became unresponsive while using a Chevrolet simulator in Concord, North Carolina. He was taken to a Charlotte area hospital. The following day, he died. He was 41. And that is where the story becomes difficult to process. Because the human mind expects major endings to have warning signs. A retirement, a long illness, a final race, a goodbye. Kyle's story didn't have that. He had plans. He had a career. He had children. He had a wife. He had a brother who had only recently experienced one of the biggest professional moments of his own life. Kurt Busch had been inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame in January 2026. Kyle had been there. The brothers had shared another important chapter in NASCAR history. It was a moment that, at the time, looked like a celebration. Now it looks painfully different, because nobody knew they were standing together during one of their final major moments as brothers. That's one of the cruelest things about sudden death. It changes the meaning of ordinary photographs. A picture that once looked normal suddenly becomes priceless. A conversation that once seemed routine becomes something you wish you could hear again. A family gathering becomes a memory, and a brother's voice becomes something you would do anything to hear one more time. For Kurt, the grief was enormous, but he didn't immediately turn to social media. He didn't immediately give interviews. He stayed quiet. That silence spoke volumes. There are moments when words simply aren't available, and when the person you've lost is your younger brother, there is no statement capable of explaining the emptiness. The NASCAR community, however, immediately surrounded the Busch family. At the Coca-Cola 600, NASCAR held a major tribute to Kyle. Kurt stood alongside Kyle's wife Samantha, Kyle's children Brexton and Len Nix, and other members of the family as the sport honored the driver who had been scheduled to compete in that very race. Imagine that moment. The race Kyle was supposed to be driving, the track where he was supposed to compete. Thousands of fans watching. And instead of Kyle climbing into the number 8, his family was there to remember him. The sport that had been his entire life suddenly had to figure out how to continue without him. NASCAR retired Kyle's number 8 from Richard Childress Racing until his son Brexton is old enough to potentially race it. That decision carried enormous symbolic weight. The number wasn't simply a number anymore. It had become part of the Busch identity. And now it represented a father and son, a legacy waiting for the next generation. But the most emotional moment came when Kurt finally spoke. On June 8th, Kurt released his first major public tribute to his younger brother. He thanked people for the support they had given the family and described his heartbreak. He also made clear that no trophy or championship could measure Kyle's impact on his life. That statement is important because it reveals the difference between public memory and private memory. The public sees championships. A brother sees childhood. The public sees 234 victories. A brother sees a kid climbing into a go-kart. The public sees the aggressive driver called Rowdy. A brother sees a person underneath the helmet. That's a Kyle Busch that Kurt was mourning. And that is the Kyle Busch that deserves to be remembered, because his personality could sometimes overshadow everything else. Kyle had a reputation for anger. He had arguments. He had controversial moments. He had confrontations. He could be difficult. But those characteristics were only one part of him. People who knew him personally often described a much more complicated individual. Someone intensely competitive but capable of generosity. Someone who could be intimidating on a racetrack but deeply devoted to his family away from it. Someone who could spend Sunday fighting another driver for a win, and then spend Monday helping a younger racer understand how to improve. That contradiction is what made Kyle interesting, and it is also why the idea of simply remembering him as an angry driver would be unfair. He was much more than that. His work away from the track demonstrated it. Kyle and Samantha Busch created the Bundle of Joy Fund, which helped families dealing with infertility. That work gave another dimension to his public legacy. He wasn't only concerned with winning races. He also understood what it meant for families to struggle privately. And perhaps that was part of what Kurt saw that fans couldn't always see. The person who cared. The person who loved being a father. The person who understood how valuable family was. That makes the timing of his death even more painful. Kyle left behind 2 children. His son Brexton was already involved in racing and had grown up around the sport. His daughter Lennox was still very young. Suddenly, the future Kyle had imagined with his children disappeared. There would be no more ordinary father-son racing weekends. No more watching Brexton develop. No more seeing his daughter grow older. No more family trips that Kyle assumed were still ahead. And for Kurt, there would be no more opportunity to watch his little brother become the older generation of the family. That's something people outside the family can't fully understand. When a sibling dies young, you don't just lose a person they were. You lose all the future versions of them you expected to meet. Kyle at 45. Kyle at 50. Kyle watching his children become adults. Kyle becoming a grandfather. Kyle telling stories about NASCAR to younger generations. All those future versions disappeared on May 21st, and Kurt had to live with that. The public, meanwhile, began revisiting Kyle's career. Old races were replayed. Old interviews resurfaced. Fans remembered the victories. They remembered the arguments. They remembered the celebrations. They remembered the famous number 18 Toyota. They remembered the number 8 Chevrolet. They remembered the M&MS colors. They remembered Bristol. They remembered the championship seasons. They remembered the comeback moments. And they remembered how often Kyle seemed capable of doing something nobody else could. His career was not ordinary. He was a driver who could win in almost any NASCAR vehicle. And that's why the 234 National Series victories are so important. They don't simply represent a large number. They represent an extraordinary appetite for racing. Kyle didn't race only because he wanted fame. He raced because he loved competition. That love was obvious, even when the results weren't going his way, even when fans were criticizing him, even when his temper got him into trouble. He kept racing. That was his identity. And perhaps that's why the loss hit NASCAR so hard. The sport didn't simply lose a champion. It lost one of its personalities. There will be other champions. There will be other winners. There will be other stars. But there will never be another Kyle Busch. That's what makes legacy so complicated. People often want to reduce someone's life to achievements. But Kyle's legacy is larger than his trophy cabinet. It includes the drivers he helped, the fans he inspired, the charities he supported, the family he built, the children he loved, the brother who now has to carry his memory, and the racing community that refuses to let his name disappear. On August 18, 2026, NASCAR officially marked Kyle Busch Day. The date was chosen intentionally, 8/18, the two numbers that became synonymous with Kyle's career. NASCAR and the wider motorsports community used the day to share memories and celebrate his impact. Reuters reported that drivers, crew members, team owners, and others participated in the tribute, with hashtags including #ForeverRowdy and #KyleBuschDay spreading across the racing world. That is how the sport deals with loss. It races. It remembers. It puts his number on cars. It tells stories. It watches old footage. And eventually, it teaches a new generation who Kyle Busch was. But for Kurt, remembrance is different. Because Kurt doesn't need a calendar date to remember Kyle. He doesn't need a social media hashtag. He doesn't need a tribute race. He doesn't need a museum exhibit. Kyle was part of his life for 41 years. That cannot be erased. And perhaps that's why Kurt's tribute carried such emotional weight. He didn't try to pretend that losing Kyle was easy. He didn't hide behind the language of professional sports. He admitted his heart was broken. He thanked the people who had supported his family. And he promised, in his own words, that Kyle's spirit will continue with him. That is not the language of a racing rivalry. That's the language of a brother. There is something else worth remembering. Kurt had already experienced what retirement and stepping away from racing could feel like. Kyle had not. Kyle was still building, still racing, still planning, still involved, still looking toward the future. His death therefore created an enormous unfinished feeling. What could he have accomplished next? Could he have won another championship? Could he have reached 70 Cup victories? Could he have helped his son Brexton reach NASCAR? Could he have built an even larger racing organization? Could he have become one of the sport's great mentors? Nobody will ever know. And that's the tragedy of a life ending at 41. Not simply the years already lived. The years that should have followed. Kyle's final weeks now feel like a series of questions. How long had he actually been sick? Could anyone have known how serious the situation was? Why did his condition deteriorate so quickly? The official information gives us some answers. His family said severe bacterial pneumonia progressed into sepsis, leading to rapid and overwhelming complications. His death certificate indicated that pneumonia symptoms had been present for days to weeks. He became unresponsive on May 20th and died the following day. Beyond that, the family has asked for privacy. And that matters, because tragedy can create a temptation to fill gaps with speculation. But the truth doesn't need to be sensationalized. What happened was already devastating enough. A healthy-looking 41-year-old athlete developed a severe infection. The infection progressed. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and his family lost him. That's the story. There doesn't need to be a conspiracy. There doesn't need to be a hidden scandal. There doesn't need to be a mysterious explanation. Sometimes the most frightening truth is simply that life can change incredibly quickly. And Kyle Busch's death demonstrated that in the most painful possible way. It also changed Kurt, at least publicly, because when you spent your life being a competitor, grief